Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Oper. I'm an urban designer from the Division of City Planning. Typically, our director, Tanya Marione, would do the introduction tonight, but she's not feeling well, so you've got me. So we're working on the Lower Heights Small Area Vision Plan. This is the second of two public meetings. Welcome if this is your first one with us, and welcome back if you've been with us for previous meetings. Yeah, so I will pass this over to our consultants over at FHI. They're working under BFJ Planning, who is the consultant for the land use element update.
Thank you, Liz. Good evening, all. My name is Ryan Walsh. I'm with FHI Studio. We thank you very much for joining us tonight and for your time. Before we get started, I wanted to walk through just some light housekeeping. You've likely all noticed that you've come into the meeting muted. This is to cut down on distracting background noise, but we absolutely still want to hear from you. And we have two primary ways to do that. The first is that the chat is open. Next slide. So chat's open. We do ask that you use the chat primarily for quick sort of clarification kinds of questions. We'll take a few if we have time after the presentation, answer a few of those questions, or if there's something real brief that is maybe misunderstood. But really where we want to hear from you in the next slide, a large portion of this meeting is going to be dedicated to breakout room, small group discussions. And when you get to the breakout rooms, you'll have full ability to unmute yourself. You can share your camera if you want or not. And here is really where we want to hear from you. When it comes time for the breakout rooms, you'll get a little pop-up on your screen asking you to join, and all you have to do is click join. If you run into some technical difficulty, or if while you're in the breakout room you have a question that you can't answer there, you can always come back out into the main room, and we'll have one or two people out there that can help you with the technical issue or answer your question. You can go ahead to the next slide. So our agenda for tonight, we're in the welcome right now. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Texa, who's going to deliver a presentation for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to go to those small group discussions I mentioned. We'll come back after that and have a recap, debrief, discuss what we discussed in those breakouts, and then close with a discussion of next steps. And as I mentioned, we'll use that chat for the clarifying questions. You should have gotten a message when you came in that's letting you know this presentation is being recorded, and that presentation will be posted on the master plan website, so you can see it there or share it with your friends, neighbors. Go ahead. Just to let you know what was done in terms of promotion of this meeting ahead of time. The city and consultant team have been making good use of social media across all the master planning accounts. Councilperson in the area has been sending out information through their listserv. We flyered, the city put physically distributed flyers to both residences and businesses in the area. And we emailed everybody who participated in the preceding virtual workshop or who signed up for master plan emails. Go to the next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Adam Texa of FHI Studio.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. I really appreciate it. So for those of you who have not been attending to date, this is just a quick overview of the study area that we're looking at for the Lower Heights, and that's really Laidlaw on the north down to Hoboken Ave on the east, bounded by really Route 139 on the south and going out to Kennedy Boulevard. Small area plans are plans that start with community derived goals and will include recommendations for how to best go about achieving those goals. This is an example of a goal, so strengthen neighborhood commercial areas. And then these are examples of sort of recommendations that one might have to support that goal. In our last meeting, we really focused on developing and refining the goals. In this meeting, we're really going to focus on the recommendations for achieving those. So for those of you who are curious where the small area vision plans live, they're really part of the land use element, which is one of many sort of topic focused reports that looks at different ways in which the city will evolve over the next 10 years. But that is not to say that it does not include recommendations from the open space, circulation, housing, and several other elements in it, as you will see in today's presentation. So the small area plans can be used by public entities to prioritize infrastructure improvements, understand desired regulatory and zoning changes, and support negotiations with developers. They can be used by civic groups to coordinate their efforts, to guide where they want to invest and where they want to make improvements, and develop new programming for the area. And finally, they can be used by private property owners to adjust their development program, identify new opportunities for investment, and hopefully guide their design decisions. We have done an incredible amount of work up to this point, much of which many of you have participated in. We've selected the areas, which you can find out about more how this area got selected on the master plan website. We had 2 rounds of stakeholder meetings. We did a round of on-demand workshops, which many of you participated in, and we had a huge turnout for. There was a meeting that focused on public goals that was goals that was very similar to this. It was a Zoom meeting. And now we are in the meeting really focused on strategies, and we'll be moving very quickly into the plan writing process. So in those first engagement activities, we really identified 3 groups of issues, themes, and then ultimately goals. The top 3 issues that were identified for focus were multimodal mobility, local environment, and then development standards. And within each of these, there were a number of themes that emerged. For example, within multimodal mobility, there was a real emphasis on Route 139 and the Bergen Arches. Within the development standards, there was a really strong focus on leveraging existing assets, for example. As a result of those sort of themes or topics that came out of there, we developed goals that were associated with each of these top-level issues. The first set of goals from multimodal mobility are the same as the ones that you saw last time, and were we heard consistently that these were the right set of goals. They are to make the lower heights a safer and friendlier place to walk and bike, enhance active transportation connections to surrounding areas, especially to downtown and Journal Square, prioritize pedestrian safety and bike lanes over vehicles through vehicle throughput on key north-south corridors, prioritize the creation of at least 1 north-south bicycle facility, make Route 139 and its crossings safer and more comfortable place for pedestrians and bicyclists, convert the Bergen Arches to an active transportation space while enhancing natural assets, and establishing a connection down Palisades Cliffs to connect Palisade and Hoboken Avenue. When it came to local environment, we heard that there was actually some significant changes that needed to happen to the goals that we presented. So the text in pink are changes from the last round of goals. So one thing that was really clearly something that came out of the discussions was that it wasn't just litter, but it was also specifically dog waste that needed to be addressed. One thing that also came out of those discussions was that there might be an opportunity to consolidate existing power lines, but that there were some concerns about the feasibility of putting things underground, and so we wanted to recognize that may not be something that happens right away, or that may take some time to happen. Finally, or thirdly, there was a real emphasis on making sure that new trees were maintained, and that the front yards especially were an opportunity for more greening and more impervious coverage improvements. And then finally, we heard pretty loud and clear that we had missed that there was just a need for more green public space within the area. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that today. And then finally, the development standards. We heard that they were substantially in accordance with sort of participants' view of what should happen in the area. With a modification to the front and side yard setbacks, lot coverage ratios really needed to be changed to improve microclimates and maintain access to air and light. At the same time, we heard that the first 6 goals, which are continue to prohibit high-rise development in the lower heights, which is less than 5 stories, limit development to 3 stories in the inner neighborhoods, focus higher intensity development up to 5 stories on north-south corridors, establish development regulations that encourage the rehabilitation of existing structures, and establish development regulations that discourage bay-on box and front yard parking, and establish development regulations that encourage housing affordability. We heard that all of those were substantially in line with where people saw the future of the neighborhood. We also came up with 5 what we called area-specific visions, or sort of sub-area visions that focused on Palisade, Baldwin, Summit, Route 139, and the interior neighborhoods. We didn't hear that there was a big demand for modifications to these visions, but as you'll see today, we spent a fair amount of time actually elaborating on those and providing some recommendations for how to go about achieving the goals for these areas. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to dive into potential strategies for you to consider and to workshop today. The way that they're going to be organized is into these groups. So there's going to be a public and green space, and interior neighborhoods recommendations, and then recommendations related to 3 corridors. And I'm going to be talking about the topics and goals in each of those areas. So it's going to sort of cut across the topics and goals are really going to cut across the discussion that is based on these larger organizing principles. So one thing that you'll see throughout this presentation is this map. You're looking at the lower heights from a sort of bird's eye perspective, as if you were flying over the area. And there's some useful orientation landmarks here that you can see, including the Bergen Arches, the 2 public schools, and the Sergeant Anthony's Park. Those will stay highlighted in addition to the road labels throughout the presentation when you see this map to help keep you oriented in this perspective. So the first round of recommendations, public and green spaces. So one thing that we heard loud and clear was that the Bergen Arches really could be a great multimodal connection and sort of cross-city multimodal connection. So we think that's important to include in this small area vision plan. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that the open space element also identifies the Bergen Arches as a cross-borough connection. And so it is not only something that is being discussed here in the small area vision plan, but is also being talked about as part of a larger citywide network. And you can look at the open space element on the master plan website now, and those are the page references for consultation. The Shade Tree Committee is another thing that we wanted to highlight here. We heard a lot about trees and the importance of them in the neighborhood. One thing to be aware of is that the Shade Tree Committee, there is a Shade Tree Committee. They're looking currently at the Jersey City Forestry Standards. They administer a payment in lieu program, which is if you remove a tree, you essentially have to pay in order to have another one planted. A community forestry management plan, and they are examining the Jersey City tree ordinance. That said, one thing that this plan could potentially recommend is for that committee to do a better job of communicating their work and improving coordination with community groups to make sure that a lot of these things that they're working on actually sort of manifest at the local level and have input at the local level. So, one of the other things that really we heard a lot of is the desire for more open space, and there is a really limited amount of it in the area, and it's something that is very difficult to find right now because it's a sort of fully built out community. But one thing that we thought could be a potentially interesting idea would be a neighborhood parklet program. So these would be things that are not associated with a business. They would be temporary. You would need a permit for them. They could have limitations in terms of both the time of the year that they operate and the hours that they operate. And we would suggest that there be a small maintenance plan for these. But this is basically an opportunity for residents to identify locations on their block where they could create open space, small little parklets for places to relax, places to hang out with their neighbors, right in their communities, right on their blocks. This is really consistent with the open space recommendations, which is focuses on designing street for kids, but also creating identifying creative approaches for city-owned assets. The next thing that we'd like you to consider is a landscape improvement grants program. So throughout the Lower Heights, there are all of these areas, all of these areas which are really underutilized spaces that are currently hardscaped. There's no real need for them to be hardscaped, but they are, and they have a real opportunity to be improved in order to address some of the greening issues and to improve the microclimates on streets. So this is just an example of how you could take a relatively small area and make changes that would really improve the streetscape in the private realm, but from the private realm perspective. Just to be aware, there are actually parts of the Lower Heights right now that are doing this incredibly well, that are utilizing these spaces. And so it's really building off of a strategy that is already actually working in the neighborhood and in the community. There are opportunities like this that exist really throughout the Lower Heights. So this is just another example in a very different sort of environment where there is lots of opportunity here to make some substantial improvements to the streetscape, but on the private realm side. This program is actually something that's being done in other places. An example is Daytona Beach in Florida, where they provide matching grant funding up to $15,000 for these kinds of improvements. I think in Jersey City, you could be looking at a substantially smaller program. These kinds of improvements, I doubt would in many instances raise to that level of $15,000. And there were opportunities for director matching grants. And one important thing about this, though, would be requirements for maintenance of those areas for a certain number of years. The city could also provide design and technical support. There are opportunities for local contracting opportunities. And one thing to think about is this is something that I think a lot of neighborhoods in Jersey City would be interested in, and the Lower Heights could really be seen as a pilot area for this kind of work. So turning now to the interior neighborhoods, those are really the areas that are not on major corridors. And one thing that we heard very clearly was that there was a desire to see more rehabilitation of existing structures rather than demolition. And so we wanted to make everybody aware of the CDBG home improvement program. This is an incentive for lower income property owners to invest in their properties. It's a deferred payment loan program that provides up to basically $25,000 for property improvements. One thing that we would recommend is that the city work to increase education awareness of this program and work closer with civic and community groups to get this funding out into the lower heights. At the same time, we think that there's an opportunity to look at the entire sort of residential section of the lower heights and designate it an area in need of rehabilitation. So this is very fundamentally important to understand that it is not a redevelopment designation, which is a very different program. It comes from the same law, the local redevelopment and housing law. But one of the major distinctions between redevelopment and rehabilitation is that there is no eminent domain permitted in a rehabilitation designation. And it is really intended to promote rehabilitation, not redevelopment. The lower heights clearly qualifies. You qualify if you have a housing stock that's majority of the housing stock is at least 50 years old. There are municipalities that have used this and designated their entire municipality an area in need of rehabilitation. And one of the things that it does is it provides a 5-year tax exemption or abatement on the improved value for any improvements to a building. So how that works basically is if you have a property, it's taxed at its sort of current value. You make improvements to that property. The increased value of your property based on those improvements is not taxed for the next 5 years. And really what this does is help to ensure that there's no real penalty from a tax perspective for making investments in your property. And one of the other advantages of an area in need of rehabilitation designation is it gives you the ability to create additional design guidance through like an overlay plan in the area. Another thing that we'd like you to consider and think about are amendments to the existing R1 zoning. So right now, we're very well aware that the R1 zoning has a number of issues in the lower heights, that it currently favors large apartment and condo units, which are not affordable. It encourages this sort of Bayonne box parking and development, which all of you identified with lots of red dots as being a really negative. It encourages demolition of existing structures because if you demolish the structure, you can build a new structure that will have a curb cut, which gets you parking, which has certain market value. It discourages the construction of street trees because you've got all these curb cuts. It has really high lot coverage standards. And there's lots of variances that have been granted. So one of the reasons why we're looking at this is sort of strongly indicates that the zone itself is not working. And one thing that is not sort of permitted in the R1 zoning are any sort of local serving neighborhood businesses, which is very typical of Jersey City and also of the lower heights, which is sort of small local businesses interspersed within predominantly residential neighborhoods. So we're going to suggest a number of changes to the R1 zone. The first has to deal with setbacks, and that is to remove the required setback and to have a setback that matches the other setbacks on the street. And one of the great things about this kind of approach is it would really eliminate front yard parking as an option in most cases, and it would lead to sort of more consistent streetscapes. So there would be less of a sort of what are often called kind of jagged tooth developments that set back significantly further than their counterparts. The other thing that would happen, or we're recommending, is that the city reduce the permitted building coverage and require more impervious surface, which means more light and air and more pervious coverage and better microclimates in the community. Another thing would be to prohibit curb cuts on lots that are 50 feet wide or less. So that's really a standard sort of Jersey City lot is about 25 feet wide. And one of the things that would do is it would sort of prohibit the Bayonne box type development, which is just a parking garage and a curb cut with two stories of residential development on top. It would create actually more options for public parking, on-street parking, and I'll get into that a little bit. And it would eliminate the incentive to demolish demolish buildings in order to build a building that has a parking garage. It would actually take away that incentive. And then it would take away the incentive, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, to sort of build the same home over and over and over again, getting that kind of ticky-tacky development that nobody seems to particularly like. So really taking a moment now just to step back from this to talk a little bit about why eliminating the single use basically parking spot or single parking spot actually would single use off-street parking spot would actually increase the supply of parking in the lower heights. It might be a little bit counterintuitive. I know it was for me the first time I thought about this. So this is sort of an example here where, you know, a standard parking spot, off-street parking spot, you know, really does end up taking up about the same amount of space as a on-street parking space because of the curb cut. So because the curb cut's there, nobody can park there. So you're really sort of swapping one for one in a lot of instances. And as a result of that, what you get is if it's a private off-street space, if somebody's not parked there, that space is unavailable and unoccupied for large portions of the day, typically when that person is not there. If it's a street space, that space is available. Somebody can come and park in it, and it sort of creates opportunities for a flow of parking, and that may not be seem like a big deal here. You may think that on a sort of single lot by lot basis, you probably might want to encourage people to have off-street parking, but when you start looking at it from a sort of district-wide perspective or a city-wide perspective, what you start to see is that you end up having a lot of instances because, you know, not everybody works during the same hours and not everybody uses their car during the same hours. If you have lots of off-street private parking, you have to build a lot of it, which during certain periods of time just doesn't get used. But if it's public spaces and it's street parking, what you can do, for example, at 6 a.m., which is when everybody is needing to park, the most number of people need to park, you're able to do that in 5 spaces on the street, whereas you would need 8 spaces in a private space because, hey, those people need the parking at noon or at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock. So really eliminating that curb cut can actually increase the amount of parking in the area, the capacity of parking. So another big amendment that we'd like you to think about considering for the R1 area is changing the density, permitted densities in the R1. So what we're talking about is increasing the density from 35 units an acre to 45 units an acre. And what that means is for a standard size 25 by 100 foot lot, which is very typical in the lower heights, you're really going from permitting 2 units per acre to 2 units per lot to 3 units per lot. We'd also suggest actually permitting a 4th additional unit on historically significant buildings. And this latter point would be a really good incentive to maintain and improve historically significant buildings in lieu of demolishing them. The benefits of this are really important. It would create smaller and therefore more affordable units. There would be a more diversity of units that you could build. It would allow smaller multifamily buildings and therefore sort of fewer of these repeated kind of cookie cutter homes. And it would provide an incentive to preserve historic preservation. Preserve historic structures. Now, some of you may be wondering why adding an additional unit would allow for smaller units and a more diversity of units. And I'm just going to give you a little example of how that would work. So in a sort of 3,500 square foot building, which is permitted right now in the R1 zone, there's only so many ways you could divide up that building. And realistically, you could split it equally and have a 2, 3, or maybe 4 bedroom units. Or you could shrink one down a little bit and make one a little bit bigger and get a 2 or 3 bedroom unit and a 4 to 5 bedroom unit. But realistically, it'd be hard to get down to a 1 bedroom or even a studio unit because nobody is going to be interested in those sort of ultra max, really large units. You just end up with way too many bedrooms. But when you divide that same building up into 3, a couple of things happen. One, you automatically reduce down sort of the size of the standard unit. So we're going from 1,750 down to about 1,200, 1,100. So those units are very quickly going to become much more affordable. At the same time, it makes it a lot easier to divide up the building into 3 units that maybe a 1 bedroom unit, a 4 bedroom unit, and a 2 bedroom unit. There's a lot more flexibility that you can get out of that. And again, which creates a more diversity of residential development types in the community, something that we know people really care about and think is important. The result is also sort of a lot of different new development typologies. So on sort of narrower lots, on lots less than 50 foot, you get something that very much looks like a lot of the development that exists in the lower heights right now. These sort of small buildings, narrow buildings with no parking. On slightly sort of larger lots, a sort of mid-sized lot from 50 to 75 foot wide lot, you would get a parking spot in there, a curb cut, and you're really looking at a small multifamily building at that size. And then, potentially at the 75 to 100 foot wide lot, which would really be looking at around 4 traditional sort of standard lots in the lower heights, you could actually potentially accommodate rear yard parking in the building. And there would be a real incentive here to kind of make a building that looks consistent and cohesive along that entire 100 or 150 feet of frontage, which again would reduce down these instances in which you're getting the same sort of cookie cutter Bayonne box put along a street. A couple more things that we'd like you to think about with the R1, that is to permit an additional unit on the condition of eliminating curb cuts. So that is existing buildings that have a curb cut and have a garage. If they get rid of that curb cut and that garage, they would be permitted an additional unit. This really is an incentive to utilize existing structures and existing housing, can make a big improvement to the streetscape, and in a lot of ways would help to encourage or legalize a lot of the things that are already happening now, which is the sort of conversion of these areas into third units, illegal third units. The next thing that we would like you to consider is allowing neighborhood serving commercial uses on corridors and major streets, and allowing the conversion of front facing parking garages into neighborhood serving commercial. This would really sort of encourage what already exists, which is lots of local serving retail in communities, but would also help to support access to neighborhood services in the area. And finally, one thing that we are discussing and would like you to consider is the inclusion of a two-story overlay that would really be focused on a couple of small areas in the lower heights and in Jersey City in general that are areas where there is a long consistency of two-story buildings, typically residential buildings in the R1, where it really wouldn't be appropriate to see a three-story building on that block. And the Lower Heights actually has a really great example of that. And this is a sort of prime example of where the addition of a three-story building on this lot would be really inappropriate. And so zoning that would protect this sort of two-story character would help preserve these buildings, but also make sure that in the event that a fire happened or there was some sort of natural disaster, that the replacement of the building would not be out of scale or out of character with the surrounding context. So I'm going to hand it over to Liz right now to talk a little bit about the Jersey City's experience with the R2 zoning and why a process of updating the R1 zoning could be really beneficial to the neighborhood and actually reduce down a lot of the issues in which variances are granted and developers sort of come in and start pushing the line on what is existing zoning.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so as we were looking at the R1 zoning, just to note the R1 recommendations that Adam was just going through were the recommendations that are currently in the land use element update draft language. So it's for recommendations for the entire city, although each area would have to be reached out to individually, and perhaps this approach would end up taking on a more tailored to specific geography recommendations. But yeah, basically we wanted to speak about the case study of the R2D zoning creation. I myself was not at planning at the time while this effort was undertaken, but planning worked very closely with the community up in Riverview on Palisades to develop this R2D zoning. There was a lot of collaboration and iterations, writing the zoning together, doing walkthroughs, doing surveys. It did take a while. Took, I think, about 4 years or so. But the first jumping off point was the Riverview Arts District, and that was kind of setting the stage for allowing for live work units and artist space within that particular area. And then the R2D zoning was adopted in 2018. So really, I just want to let you all know that after all this kind of work goes in, work from the public side, the community's side, and then work on from city planning, it's we're going to honor all those efforts and not support or entertain variances within that zone after going through that process with the community.
Thanks, Liv. I really appreciate that. So now we're really going to get into these corridors and the recommendations for the corridors, and we're going to start with Route 139. We heard loud and clear that Route 139 needs a lot of multimodal improvements. So one thing that we think the plan should recommend is redesigning Route 139 using the NJDOT Complete Streets Manual. This was really sort of effectively shown in the Fix Route 139 website. And we think a lot of the recommendations there are worth entertaining and worth discussing. or worth discussing. So I think that's a very important critical step to making Route 139 more pedestrian and bicycle friendly. At the same time, we think it's really important to actually look at the corridor itself and the entire stretch of Route 139. There's some really inhospitable environments for pedestrians along Route 139. You're really right up next to a highway. The sidewalks are wide, which is great, but there's really no protection for you walking along that sidewalk. I would not want to walk along that sidewalk with a young child, for example. So one thing that we are recommending that the DOT consider is the inclusion of sort of protections and enhancements along the corridor that would help protect residents or pedestrians, excuse me. And that could include like a raised strip. It might include raised beds, sort of these big planters with trees in them, or the use of bollards. There's a lot of different solutions that have different benefits and trade-offs, and likely there would be a need to utilize a combination of these based on the specific context along the corridor. At the same time, we'd like you to consider whether it is appropriate to update the zoning for this area along Route 139. So we did an analysis. This is a sort of zoomed in of just this area along Route 139. This is right here is Bergen Avenue. That's just sort of the area. And so it's really this area along Fleet Street, Route 139. And we looked at the different land uses there. And as you can see, there's a lot of different land uses here, including commercial, industrial, there's some vacant land, some multifamily land, and there's a lot of diversity of residential types in this area. However, the R1 zoning really doesn't permit any of that. It permits houses of worships and essential services, but no industrial uses are permitted, no commercial uses are permitted, no multifamily is permitted. And so I'm actually going to launch a poll right now. And, just we'll have opportunity to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but we'd like you to think about what uses you would like to see considered along the sort of entire stretch of Route 139. So going back to this map, if you can see it, sort of all of those areas here highlighted in blue. And you should be able to select more than one option here. Looks like a few of you are taking some time to think about this, which is great. People still sort of sharing their ideas here. A little over 3/4 of you have responded. Give you people another minute or two here, or a couple 10-15 seconds to plug in your answers. Great. So I'm just going to end the poll here, and you'll have an opportunity to talk about this in your breakout rooms. But it looks like retail and restaurants is something that people would definitely like to see along there. Office uses, sort of people have a mixture of thoughts about residential in that area, as well as sort of light industrial, auto sales and repair. And certainly a lot of interest in community and civic facilities. So that's great. The next corridor that we want to talk about is the Baldwin Avenue and Summit corridors. So the first thing that we think that the plan should recommend based on the goals that you all identified is support for the one-way pairs of north-south bike lanes and traffic on Baldwin and Summit. So this is something that is part of the bike master plan, and what would really look at converting Baldwin north to one way and Summit south one way, and adding bicycle facilities along there. We'd also think that it's important to talk about tree planting and trash cans and other streetscape improvements, as well as looking at loading zones, bus shelters, and time-restricted parking, among other recommendations for improvements along these corridors based on what we heard in the last meeting. The other thing would be to look at sort of a corridor cleaning program, including a litter action plan. It's something that we heard actually in all the small area plans. It's something that needs to be addressed. Other options are neighborhood cleanup days, as well as a sort of spruce it up program that really came out of the Bergen United Communities Plan, which would look to work with local business owners to have them help support cleanup of the corridors. And then the next thing we'd like you to consider on these corridors is looking at updates to the zoning and conversion of them from R1 zoning to R2D zoning. So this is a mixed-use residential and commercial district. It's at 75 acres per unit, which is an increase from the 35 units per acre, which is currently allowed in the R1. It's got some higher lot and building coverages than the R1, but it would support 4-story development on wider lots and 5-story development, or excuse me, on narrower lots, and 5-story development on wider lots, with the 5th story having to be set back, sort of pulled back from the front of the facade. The R2 standards right now, R2D standards right now have no parking requirements for adaptive reuse of existing buildings, which is a great incentive for the preservation of existing buildings. And parking is required for new construction that it occupies 75 feet or more of the lot frontage. We think this is a really positive zone for the area, or could be a positive zone, with potentially some additional modifications that would allow for the 5th story on the condition of potentially the creation of open space or a plaza, meeting neighborhood design standards, or investment in streetscape improvements. And these may be improvements that the city as a whole would like to see in all R2D zoning areas. The benefits of rezoning these areas as R2D would be to reduce demand for demolition in interior lots. It would sort of give a space for where that to occur. Incentivize more neighborhood serving retail. Concentrate development opportunities on these sort of major corridors, and really, provide opportunities for the revitalization of these corridors that people expressed an interest in seeing. Something to pay attention to is that this R2D zone is really consistent with the responses that we heard from the visual preference survey in the on-demand workshop, both with respect to sort of existing development in these areas, as well as the potential for new construction along these corridors. Finally, the last corridor to pay attention to is the Palisade Avenue corridor. So what we're looking at here now, and it's a little hard to see in this area, is this area behind sort of the Palisade Avenue, between Palisade and Hoboken Avenue. This is really the parking area that services the hospital that is behind the former sort of and current residential development on Palisade Avenue. And if you've been back there and you've poked your head around back there, or had to park to go to the hospital, you know that there's actually some pretty spectacular views of the New York City and of the sort of surrounding area. And so we think that there's an interesting opportunity to look at this as a sort of boardwalk area that would include a scenic overlook and potentially a sort of grand staircase that would connect Hoboken Avenue and Palisade Avenue, making it for a much improved connection into the downtown Jersey City and as well as north. The one thing to be really aware of is this is really an idea at this point. It's something that would have to go through a lot of work and coordination and is really a concept for you to consider and think about. This property is not owned by the city currently right now, so would have to go through a process of working with the property owner in order to find a good use for this area that really isn't in its sort of current configurations developable. The next thing that we'd like you to consider on Palisade Avenue would be changing the medical zoning, really shrinking down the size of the medical zoning. Right now, it currently goes all the way up Palisade Avenue and includes a lot of these residential development or residential buildings that are historic. We would suggest that it be changed to R1 from medical, which would allow it to be used for commercial uses, as well as to recommending to permit medical office for the conversion of existing buildings. This would really encourage historic preservation and adaptive reuse of the existing buildings. So I know that was an incredibly large amount of information to digest, and I know I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to go through very quickly some quick polls to find out, really your sort of gut reactions about whether or not we're hitting the mark on these recommendations, and then move very quickly into the breakout rooms. I apologize if I was sharing those results the whole time. So the first thing that we'd like you to do is look at the public and green space strategies that are shown here on the slide, and to tell us, given the goals, do you support these strategies? And that would be the Bergen Arches strategies, the Shade Tree Committee, the neighborhood parklets, and the landscape improvement grant strategies. So it looks like people are pretty quickly making up their minds, and give people a couple more seconds to lock in their answers. So that's great. Thank you really for those responses. I'm going to share the results with you. Looks like there is a fair amount of support for these recommendations, maybe with some minor modifications, but at least a few of you would like to see some substantial modifications to the recommendations, and look forward to having those discussions in the breakout groups. Now I'm going to ask about the interior neighborhood recommendations and hear your thoughts on those. And so that would be sort of expanding the information about the home improvement program, designating the areas in need of rehabilitation, and making the R1 zoning updates. So about half of you have got your answers in here. Give people a couple more seconds to get their thoughts in. Great, we really appreciate these as well. So looks like people looking for some modifications to this, which we totally are open to the idea. Some people who are just not interested in these recommendations, or think they don't meet the goals that we identified. So that's important to recognize. And it sounds like some people would like to see some substantial modifications to these. So sounds like this is going to be a robust topic for the facilitators in the breakout rooms. And then finally, getting to the corridor recommendations, we've just got 3 more of these. So looking at, oh, stop sharing the results. The Route 139 recommendations, so that's improving the crossings, protecting and enhancing sidewalks, and updating the zoning. Great. Looks like lots of support with this. A few people who would like to see some modifications to the Route 139 recommendations. So I'm going to stop sharing the results of that and ask you about the Baldwin and Summit Avenue recommendations. Great. So sharing those results, it looks like some minor modifications are needed to these recommendations, but overall some support for these. And finally, we're going to stop sharing the results and look at Palisade. And this is the last poll question for you all. Give people another second or two. Great, and it looks like there's some interest in some these recommendations with some minor modifications and potentially some more significant ones, all to be discussed in the breakout groups, which is great. So before we go to those breakout groups, I just wanted to ask Ryan if there are any questions that I apologize, I probably should have gotten to these before we did the poll questions. But if there were any questions from the chat that need clarification.
So the chat has been very active. I just want to note that we have received all of the comments and questions. We want to preserve as much time as possible for the breakout rooms. But there were a handful of questions and comments related to the R1 designation. So maybe if we could just spend a couple minutes dealing with those, and then
Absolutely.
With the rest of everything, we'll incorporate it into the comments. But so let's see, there's a few questions about the R1. Wouldn't the density change encourage developers to demolish all the 1- and 2-family buildings in the heights to make way for 3-unit buildings? We need to, this is going to significantly add density without thinking about infrastructure. We need to preserve the R1 with minor changes rather than increased density. Can you elaborate on permitting a 3rd unit on the condition of eliminating a curb cut in the R1?
Can you slow down and just I can tackle a couple of that. I think that that's a really important consideration here, and something to certainly think about sort of what is the incentive of this. I think what is really critical to understand right now is that when it comes to the current density standards, we're not changing the bulk requirements, which affect the sort of height of the building, or excuse me, we're not talking about changing the height restrictions on there. So the scale of the development would not change significantly. And what's happening already is that there is demolition that's happening in order to create these, quite frankly, higher and more expensive units, because they can attract these prices. And a big part of that is the benefit of having a parking garage. We think that by increasing the density standard here, that you could actually put a stop to some of that, and that you could get more affordable development instead of sort of what's happening there. It's going to be, quite frankly, a difficult situation for the lower heights over the next 10 years. There are increasing land values in the area, and regardless of what you do for zoning, that is going to create incentives to make substantial changes to the buildings on top of the land, in order to realize the value of the underlying land. But we think that this would generally benefit the community towards a lot of the affordability goals and the preservation goals that were identified. Ryan, there was a question about the curb cut, and I'm sorry, what was it again?
Can you elaborate on permitting a third unit on the condition of eliminating a curb cut?
Yeah, so the idea would be is right now there are a lot of buildings where you've got a curb cut in a front garage, and what it would mean is if you wanted to add a third unit, if you wanted to convert essentially your garage into a third unit, which we see a lot of throughout the city, then you would have to eliminate that curb cut. So you couldn't use your front yard for parking, basically returning parking back to the public domain from the private space.
Okay, and I want to acknowledge that there are a lot more comments, and we've got all of those captured, and we can discuss some of your questions in the breakout rooms, or if you need an answer, you can come back out here to the main room. But I think at this point we should break up into the small groups and take the conversation from there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and if anybody has any, really technical questions, I will be in the main room, and you want to bounce out, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you all for coming back. I really appreciate it. We have a very limited amount of time left. We wanted to make sure that you all had a time to have a sort of robust discussion in your breakout rooms, and we're going to be going into the notes in depth and the key takeaways. So we'll be talking with your facilitators too. So I want to make sure that you understand that all that hard work and conversation is going to be taken into account. In the short couple of minutes that we have, I was wondering if each facilitator might want to take just a moment to talk about sort of what were some of the key points or key things that were discussed in your group, and then we can move on to talking about sort of next steps.
I'll chime in. I think I was room 3. We had a good discussion about mobility. We were talking about crossings, it was mostly focused on 139, I believe. that it should be really, the friction should be increased there to make it a more of amenity for the surrounding community, and kind of some strategies to do that and some of the roadblocks of doing that. Regarding the local environment, I think there was concern. We kind of focused more on some of the amenities or local grocers in the area and how there might be a dearth of that. And if there is, what that means for curbside management, and that's kind of how we circled back to local environment. And then for the land use or the design standards, we talked a lot about R1 and kind of meeting that balance of allowing for more density, but not encouraging demolitions across the board.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. That's really helpful.
Okay, so in my group, regarding the multimodal mobility, definitely support for the Route 139 improvements and seeing that there could be safety enhanced by some of these planter ideas that were shown. We have a lot of support for Bergen Arches and utilizing that as both a multimodal greenway and also as just a public open space as a park. And then just wanted to also emphasize the difficulty for pedestrian crossings of Palisade Avenue. So something to look at improving and enhancing in this area as well. To the local environment, we had some good conversation, some different sentiments on parklets, but I think what ultimately came out of it was looking to create permanent open spaces. So maybe it's a parklet, but it's feels much more permanent than some of the COVID parklets we've been seeing popping up through the city. Potential ideas to acquire some property and kind of allow for these like mid-block pocket parks as well. Also, just generally, we need more trees, and let's make that happen and maintain them. We had some good conversation about the development. You can read some more about that in our notes, but I think the interesting thing that came up was maybe the 2-story area that we had discussed. Maybe that's more of historic zoning than this 2-story zoning. So yeah, that was a really interesting one. We had some other great comments too about density, but I'll let my other facilitators chime in.
So we definitely had a great conversation about making safety improvements along 139, not only just going across 139, but also east and west along the corridor, and also paying specific attention to different users who are crossing. So those who are young, those who are old, because they have special, or they have different needs when crossing these corridors that aren't always factored in. And then there was also kind of a conversation about whether these improvements to or access to the Bergen Arches is the most important green space investment in the area, or maybe some other areas should be prioritized over the Bergen Arches to start with. And then, yeah, just a good conversation about obviously wanting to reduce impervious surface to the best of the ability, and a lot of support for those grants and tax abatements to keep to incentivize those improvements. And then we had a great conversation about the R1, as many of the other groups did, and just desire to really study this more in depth before any significant changes are actually implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And yeah, to be really clear, we want to make sure that that all of the note takers were sort of furiously taking notes as part of the discussion, and so we are going to be diving deep into those conversations as part of our next steps, which is really to start the plan writing process. But before I do that, I want to hand it over to Ryan to do a quick little something.
Sure. Thanks for that, Adam. So if this were a normal in-person meeting, we'd be sneaking around the room, surreptitiously taking photos, documenting the process, getting all of you at tables. Obviously, we can't do that in this process. So I'm going to ask a favor for all of you who are willing, if you would turn your cameras on. We'll give you a moment to get the lighting right, get your hair fixed just so, and we'll do big, cheesy smiles, just to document the process, let everyone know that you were here. So I'll give you another 5 seconds or so to get yourself just right. And we'll say 1, 2, 3, cheese. I'll do 1 or 2 more. And thank you very much for indulging.
Yeah, thank you all very much. So like I said, the sort of next steps on this is to dig into your comments, to make modifications to these recommendations based on that, and to put together a first draft of the plan. And so based on that, we are going to put out a draft plan that will be open for public comment, and then we'll go through the normal adoption process for a master plan, which will include public hearings. So this is not sort of a we disappear and go and you never see this again. There will be an opportunity to review and comment on this to make sure that we heard you all correctly. That said, this is my last time to sort of stand in front of all of you personally and or virtually, I guess it would be. And I just wanted to thank everybody who has participated both tonight and all the way along the way from the sort of initial stakeholder meetings to the on-demand workshops to the last meeting. You all have been just really great in giving honest and I thought thoughtful feedback on all these recommendations, and we've really appreciated the opportunity to work with all of you and to hopefully create a plan that is consistent with your vision for this area. So thank you, and I'll just turn it over to Liz to see if she has any final comments from the city before we end for the evening.
Yeah. Just wanted to say thank you, everybody, and keep your eyes out for an email from me with the draft and kind of the next steps of going to planning board, and we're planning to have some public showcase of these things as well. So yeah, I'll keep you posted, and thank you so much for being a part of this process.
Thank you all very much.
Night, everybody.
Good night.